The war had ended 1,000 years ago, or so the treaties said. Yet humanity still carried its scars among the stars, etched in metal hulls the color of old ash, in songs that counted distances in generations, in hands that knew how to build shelters out of nothing but vacuum and stubbornness. They called the ship Hestia because naming mattered when nothing else did. It was a long, quiet cylinder suspended in a gulf of black and pearl, a greenhouse wrapped around a furnace. No flashy fins, no shimmering warp sails, none of the aesthetic twitches the rest of the galaxy adored. The Hestia's engines wore armor like a medieval bell, and her radiators unfolded like iron wings from a bygone age. She was a slow ship in a galaxy that had forgotten patience, a dark arrow that did not slip or fold or blink through space. She trudged. She endured. From a distance, the fleet of the Kharid Ascendancy glittered. Silver, blue, prismatic, beautiful ships built by a civilization whose planets were louder than thunder. Transluminal halos tightened and released around them like the breathing of gods. When they arrived in the petrol system, every sensor boy woke and whispered, "The Kharid have come to watch the spectacle." They had heard rumors of the human slow ship. Every culture in the bright spiral had. Rumors were the easiest currency. A caravan of information peddlers, a joke traded at the edge of a worm gate. The humans are still doing it. They're still flying sublight metal coffins, carrying seeds and stories and little brass bells to remind themselves of Earth, that scrap heap they burned and healed and left. Slow, sentimental, soft. The Kharid gathered to laugh and to harvest salvage after the laughter died. Hestia didn't know, or rather, Hestia knew and did not care. The ship had been built during a century of silence after the Great Reversal, when human engines failed and the slip drive turned on its makers in a cascade of annihilation. Humanity had outlawed the fold. No more cheating time. No more winged whims that tore holes in the dark. Only patient flight. Only honest motion. Only what the universe would accept without screaming. Her captain was Mara Ilyin, born under the slow pulse of 3 suns far from Earth, and like all children of the quiet fleets, she grew up listening to the tick of air recyclers as other children listened to rain. She had the posture of someone who refused to bow even when alone, and a voice that struck like the edge of a bell. On the day the Kharid came to mock, Mara stood in the observation keel, a place of slanted glass beneath the ship's spine, and watched the Perseid arc of the dust belt blur across their bow. Hestia had been coasting for 14 years on stored momentum, her fusion hearts down to a heartbeat, radiators pulled, lights dimmed. Everything that could sleep slept, everything that could wait waited. "Captain," said the ship. Hestia's voice was gentle, not feminine or masculine, not young or old. It had the texture of breathed glass. "They have arrived, the observers." Mara's hands tightened at the small of her back. A palm was calloused where she liked to turn the wheels herself, pretending the enormous gyros answered to muscle rather than mathematics. Numbers. 237 discrete slipspace signatures. The Kharid lead ship is the Luminous Edict. 36 parasite craft, 20 press vessels, 1 salvager convoy prepositioned outside the plane. There are also 10 philanthropic watchers from the Assembly of Sages. "Philanthropic," Mara repeated, and nodded at the word as if it were an old acquaintance who owed her money. "Best attendance yet." Hestia dimmed the external panes. Outside, distant ships blossomed in and out of their own distortions, light bending around them like water thrown from a basin. The Kharid liked to paint shoulders on things that didn't have them. Every ship in their fleet wore an ornamental ridge like a collarbone. Mara loved them for it. She loved a galaxy that fussed and fretted and decorated itself, because it meant the galaxy still felt safe. "Begin final integrity checks," she said softly, mostly for herself. The words were tradition, not necessity. Hestia could have whispered the incantations alone in the dark. "Bring the harvest rings to readiness. Prime the cradle, wake the core. One long breath, then another. The ship hummed more deeply than before. In a cavern beyond biology, a sunless vial shivered against zero-G cradles. It was small, no larger than a fist, and swaddled in fields that held reality like a knot-held rope. The payload had waited a long time. It could have waited longer. Patience was the weapon's skin, its blood, and its eyes. Patience summed into mass. You may think of final prayer, Hestia murmured. Our window remains optimum for 14 minutes. Mara did not pray. She had learned her god wore no face, but she remembered a boy in hydroponics who sang to the beans as if they were bees, a woman who carved saints into the webbing of her hammock, her own father stitching a quilt from mission patches older than the hull. To remember in a ship like this was close to prayer. The Kharid hailed them openly then, lacquered voice blooming on every systemic band. The translation software gave it a flavor like minted sugar. "Human vessel Hestia," said the commander of the luminous edict, "we salute your determination. We have brought observers to commemorate your attempt. We will record your valor. We request that you share telemetry for the historical record. We will promise you a gentle salvage of any remains." Mara smiled. She imagined the commander practicing the statement in a clean room with mirrors, the way you practice condolences for a distant cousin you didn't like. She imagined his aides adjusting the line about gentle salvage. They were, perhaps, not cruel. They were simply unaware of how many different kinds of dignity existed. She answered with formality because there was power in old forms. "Kharid Ascendancy, you are free to record. Our telemetry is classified. Our remains have no intention of being gentle." Her bridge crew, 3 officers in a room that could have held 50, did not look up. They tended to the arcs of breath the way monks tended wicks. On the bulkhead above the nav tank, a faded patch bore the words, "We are the people of long distances." The ink had bled into the fabric like regret. Somewhere behind the smug facades and glittering hulls, the Kharid laughed. It rolled across channels and tucked itself into private frequencies like tucked-in hymns. A slowship was a story they told themselves to feel superior. A slowship was a myth that walked around, reminding the wise to be prudent and the bored to be cruel. Hestia shifted her angle. In the ink ahead, a pale show of dust indicated the orbital plane of a small gas giant. It danced around a star only a little older than the ship. The dust did not know it was about to be important. "We are in phase," Hestia said, voice dropping. "Confirm again, are you ready, Mara?" "Ready," Mara whispered. "Then we will proceed." The Kharid expected a launch. What they saw at first looked like a malfunction. Hestia didn't open with fire. She unrolled mirrors, great sheets of invisible geometry that drank light and refused to give it back. She waked her heat sinks and spread them along invisible rails. She opened her throat and the ship inhaled. "What is she doing?" Someone asked on an open band. "What is the human vessel doing?" Mara did not answer. She watched the cradle open in the heart of the ship. She watched the vial hum louder than sound. She felt the tremor through her feet, an echo of long-ago earthquakes that her ancestors took for the voice of gods. She stood without moving and was moved through. There are ways to win a fight that do not look like a fight. Human children learned this before they learned to write in vacuum cursive. Marathoners taught it to sprinters. Farmers taught it to generals. Hestia was both farm and marathon and a general in a world that border policed miracles. In the cradle, not commandant but midwife, Hestia warmed the vial like a hand warms a heart. Microcurrents coaxed the payload into wakefulness. The payload, with the courtesy of a lion at pasture, opened one eye only. It did not burn. It did not scream. It became heavy in ways mass is not. 1,000 years ago, when the slip drive betrayed humanity, they learned a little about how the universe stitched itself together. They learned where the seams lay. They learned that if you push too hard, the cloth tears and everything leaks. But they learned too that seams are strong, stronger than fabric. They learned how to hook a finger into a seam and pull without breaking. This was the purpose of the payload. This was the one shot. Trajectory, Mara said. Hestia sang the coordinates the way a surgeon hums while washing. Vector Epsilon 91 by 7. Target commitment window tolerances 3 sigma. The edict class runs a slip echo to the star's third flux line every 20 arc minutes. They will be there. Will, Mara echoed. We're throwing a word at the future. Fine. She smiled again. Throw hard. The Kharid would think a projectile could not strike what did not yet exist, but that was only if you thought of existence like a child thinks of bedtime. When it's dark, nothing happens. They forgot the universe keeps its receipts. The Hestia aimed at where a ripple would be, a ripple cast by the Kharid flagship's preferred way of falling into light. 15 seconds, Hestia said. 7, 2, release. There was no roar, the cradle did not bang. A star did not die. Hestia exhaled. Something small left the ship and became indistinguishable from everything that was not ship. It was a bead, a seed, a grain. It got heavy and then heavier and then heavier until heavy was a word that did not apply anymore. Because gravity does not need a resume when it works. The payload fell forward into a future that had been politely informed of its arrival. The Kharid saw nothing for a minute. Then their star maps hiccuped. Then the edict's navigators, trained in the ballet of partial causality, frowned at harmless blurs. Then the luminous edict came gleaming through a slip corridor like a jewel on a chain, and met a place where space had been reminded of a promise it had made to matter an hour ago. The universe, when surprised, listens to itself. It heard the bead and agreed. For one trembling instant, the luminous edict's slip bubble grazed a knot tied in the seam of real. The knot let go. The bubble, delicate as a soap film compared to that weight, collapsed. Momentum remembered what it used to be. The flagship came out of the corridor not like a dancer but like a bruise. It didn't explode. It stopped. Not all at once. Nothing in the bright spiral truly stops all at once, but enough. Enough that fields tore, that energy moved to places where energy had not been invited, that crew were thrown against their harnesses, and remaining harnesses became knives. The edict shuddered like a struck tuning fork, and the shock wrote itself into the memory of every ship watching. A slow projectile could not have done this. A slow mind could not have set it up. The human slowship had not fired a bullet. It had fired a question that space-time had to answer honestly. Silence spread like frost. The galaxy needed breath it did not have. On Hestia, the light stayed dim. The radiators stayed out like a bird's careful wings. Hestia's voice stayed the same. Mara bowed her head for a heartbeat to honor the dead. Not only theirs, but anyone who had died at the hands of human cleverness to toughen that cleverness into this. She had known this moment in training. She had tasted it in the salt of the water recycler when she was 15 and failed a graphics exam. She had dreamed it when she cut her hair alone, a right on some ships that meant, I have no one to braid me, but I still own my head. Second phase, Hestia said. Mara lifted her eyes. Good, quiet as you can. The Kharid were not fools. Their fleet commanders were old fish who had learned the currents. They recovered from shock faster than most, folding and sliding away, fanning sensors, building models on models. And yet there was something in the way they moved that felt like a wilder confusion underneath, the rough puzzle of strong people surprised. One of the press ships, bright as a carnival, flashed a string of questions on broadband. Request interviews, request perspective, request confirmation of non-lethal intent. The philanthropic watchers emitted a generalized hum of disappointment at all forms of violence. The salvagers drifted farther out like sharks bored with a whale that had too much fat and not enough blood. The luminous edict did not answer anyone. She hung with dignity, half-conscious, like a queen who had fallen asleep in public but would not admit it. Hestia was not done. Slowship did not mean single trick. It meant patience had allowed the building of strange farms. From her bays, Hestia released plumes of glitter that were not glitter and clouds of gas that was not gas. They were seeds, too, designed to make opinions in the vacuum. They drifted outward and drank the local radiation. They adjusted themselves and became thin and wide and thinner and wider still until they were net spun of mathematics, hung from points only Hestia understood. What is she doing now? The question bled through from a pressed ship too sure it could not be blocked. Mara did not speak. Her crew did not speak. Hestia spoke for them all privately. We are making shade. In the space between the edict and the star, the nets drank light. They asked for nothing else. They were mirrors that agreed to be more than mirrors for a little while. They redirected and braided and slung photons the way children braid hair, with tenderness and an understanding of knots. A corridor of darkness coalesced, a tunnel with walls of patient brightness. The Kharid slip math demanded more than mass and velocity. It needed light, needed gradients they could ride like a fish rides a river. The Hestia starved the river and dug a canal of her own. Any attempt to run risked scraping a keel against V-shaped shadow. Transmission from the edict, Hestia said softly. Mara nodded. The voice was not minted sugar now. It was paper, dry and still. Human vessel, we are injured. We request assurance that you will not strike again. We request permission to withdraw. Mara swallowed. She spoke so that every listening ship would hear the words clearly and remember them when they went home to their dinners and their children and their petty politics. Ascendancy, we did not strike to destroy you. We struck to prove we could be left alone. Withdraw, yes, but listen while you go. She breathed again. She remembered Earth then the way you remember a parent you disappointed, with love and with the knowledge love is not always enough. We do not warp because we learned what that did to us, what we did to ourselves with it. We move slowly and precisely. We will not attack you beyond this lesson, but if you come to mock us and take from us as if we were a museum with a broken lock, then no, we have studied the seams you ignore. Leave now. It would have been easy to add anger, it would have been satisfying. Mara did not. She made the words heavy, not hot. Silence again. A long thought. Hestia measured the flux of the edict's drives and estimated how many tears each crew member had shed. She told no one, she only waited. Understood, the commander said at last, and even his sugar voice could not sand off the edge of understanding. We withdraw. Our reports will reflect that you have novel methods. Thank you, Mara said. Safe travels. That should have been the end. The galaxy should have folded back into itself like a satisfied cat, but someone always throws a rock at the quiet water. A Kharid captain less disciplined than his commander took insult where none was given. He commanded a young ship nicknamed Vindicator whose paint hadn't faded and whose crew wore polished metals with embarrassingly sharp corners. He slashed the Vindicator toward the tunnel of darkness and fired a teasing lance at one of the nets, the way a boy kicks at a door to frighten a child inside. The net did not break. It reached. The edge of it folded, and light inside the tunnel shifted in a slow, irresistible curve. For a breath, the Vindicator rode a brightness it did not know the name of, and in that brightness every metal part of the ship remembered it had once been ore. Everything tried to fall the smallest possible distance all at once. The Vindicator bent. It did not snap, but every petty superiority in its commander's blood snapped like badly glued wood. He screamed something private. He cut engines. The ship tumbled gracelessly through its learning. This time Mara did not speak. Hestia did not speak. The edict did. Stand down, Vindicator, the commander said. He sounded old now, not in years, but in a way that recognized salt. Stand down and learn the value of listening. The Vindicator drifted to a halt, like a child panting after running in circles. The philanthropic watchers typed moral essays. The press vessels ejected new drones like seeds from a shaken pod. The salvagers hung always at the edge, waiting for the universe to tell them which kind of meal this would be. "Shade complete," Hestia said. "Nets will hold while we finish." Mara turned. Her 3 officers looked back at her the way stones look at a river. She nodded to the leftmost, Hakin, who had never learned to speak except with numbers etched on his palm in grease pencil. He winked, a nervous reflex that looked like bravery. She nodded to the second, Alia, who sewed spare thread into little animals and hid them in air registers. Alia's soft mouth went hard. The third, Matsu, whose hair silvered all at once at 30 when his lover died, looked at the patch on the wall instead of at his captain. He touched the words with a thumb. "Begin collection," Mara said. Hestia's harvest rings came alive. From within the nets, particles sang through channels shaped just so by patient math. The ship drank scattered light and random wind, made warm by 1,000 unimportant collisions, and turned it into something cold and fierce. This was not a weapon, not exactly. It was a harvest in the old human sense, the kind that made winter survivable. But winter at star scale has predators too, and predators prefer a hungry prey. When the Kharid saw that the human slowship was pulling juice from the sun the way a monk drew silence from an empty room, they made the appropriate faces. Faces are universal. A dozen captains began to compose letters to their admirals explaining why, if it came to it, the ascendancy should leave the slowships alone. That was when the third thing happened. The thing Hestia and Mara had planned for and hoped would not be necessary. A flock of freebooters, unrelated to the ascendancy but sniffing around the edges of their displays like rats around a banquet hall, decided an injured flagship, and a cluster of distracted observers made the universe favorable to petty larceny. They came in on low emission. They came in carrying spines instead of brains. And one of them climbed so close to the Hestia's belly that, for a moment, Mara thought it was a scrap of shadow. "Contact," Hestia said. "No panic. Machines like Hestia do not know fear, they know priorities. 4 vessels, all small, one large enough to be a slaver equipped with molecular reins, vectoring for boarding." Alia set her hands flat on the console and for the first time since morning spoke. "I will kill them with the forward harvest if you say." "No," Mara said. "No, that's for winter." "What then?" Hakin asked with his eyes. The grease on his palm made a comet smear across the consoles. Mara had no monologues ready. She had made herself ready for quiet victories and quieter mercy. The universe had called for another thing. She called the galaxy. "This is Hestia," she said on an open band. "We are targeted by unaligned freebooters. Ascendancy, we formally request the protection afforded to neutral demonstration craft in contested observation zones." There was no law that said the Kharid had to care. There was only a line of footnotes in an old treaty, a line of gratitude in a parade 600 years ago, a child who had been saved by a human doctor on a station whose name had been lost. There were always strings in the dark tying people to people. The edict spoke immediately. "Granted," said the commander, "no sugar at all." Edict to fleet. Move to shield the Hestia. And so the observers who had come to laugh moved like meat between the human slowship and the rats that thought it was fun to pull at a seam. The philanthropic watchers became useful. The press vessels were not built to screen anything more dangerous than boredom, but they slid between anyway and lit their hulls bright to disrupt targeting. The salvagers adjusted their distance to an honorable remove. The freebooters were not prepared to be stared at by a galaxy. They swerved like flies. The bigger one, perhaps braver, perhaps dumber, kept coming. It was a long gray fish with a mouth that unfolded into hooks. It came to chew on a human ship, and the universe told it, "Not today." Mara did not fire again. She let the nets do what nets do. They affected currents. The freebooter flew along an edge of light exactly as it should not have done and found itself turning where it didn't wish to turn, chewing its way through glare as if it were food. The Hestia did not grin. Hestia kept harvesting. The freebooter went from brave to bored to angry to worried to gone. Only then did Mara turn toward the edict with whatever expression people wore when they had met and survived together. She had never seen that look on her own face, so she didn't know what it contained. Hestia did, and recorded it and saved it in an archive that smelled like warm paper. Ascendancy, Mara said, thank you. Human vessel, the edict answered, likewise. The philanthropic watchers wrote this exchange down and used words like solidarity that they rarely got to use without irony. The press ships, sensing a different kind of story, switched to softer angles. Somewhere an economist put a pin in a map and whispered, "New equilibrium." The slow ship finished its harvest. The nets wound themselves back into patient seeds. The radiators folded like tired wings. Everything that had woken put itself to sleep again. The Hestia returned to the posture of a pilgrim who had asked a hard question and received an answer without being struck. "Course," Hestia said inside the hush. Mara rested her palm on the rail. The metal was warmer than it should have been. Always the ship told the truth. "Forward," she said, and she did not have to say toward what. Toward the garden. Hestia had been bound for a world where there was nothing yet but a catalog number and a windless beach of dreams. The car had parted to let them go. Some of the ship captains bowed their hulls without knowing that this is what their angles meant. Others looked away because to look was to admit something moved inside them never taught to move. The edict remained still and proud, dignity preserved, a bruise healing under paint. As the Hestia passed, one of the philanthropic ships transmitted a sound. It was not language. It was a tone. You could read it as apology or benediction depending on how you felt about guilt. Humanity had learned to hear both at the same time. Mara retired to her small cabin for the first time in a day and a half. She didn't sleep. She didn't cry. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and stared at a photograph that had been pinned to the wall by gum, because magnets confused one of the old systems here and Hestia refused to let them replace it. The photograph was of a crowded Earth street. The people were blurry in motion. None of them faced the camera. It had been taken centuries before she was born. She did not know why she loved it. Perhaps because it was motion and she had called motion home. She remembered the payload, how its heaviness had been a living thing, and for the first time understood that her civilization had done something dangerous and precise and necessary. She knew the Kharid would reverse engineer and panic and bluster. She knew they would also respect. She understood that she had spent her youth curled around a plan like a lizard around an egg, and now the egg had hatched. Alien knocked at the door, respect marking each sound. "Captain," she said softly through the panel, "the edict requests a private channel." Mara lifted her head. "Take it on the observation keel," she told Hestia, and rose because rising matters to the person who sees you do it. On the keel, the star line was simpler again, just dust and light, the bruise of a freebooter's panic fading like spilled dye. Hestia framed the private channel in blue. The Kharid commander appeared without faceplate, eyes rimmed as if by lack of sleep he would not admit to. He did not look dignified now. He looked human in the old philosophical sense. Mortal, complicated, capable of baseball-level grief. "Captain Ilyin," he said. "Commander," she answered. She did not supply his name, she hadn't caught it, and Hestia had not offered. Names can be weapons when you choose to be careless with them. He hesitated, then did a thing very few leaders in the galaxy remembered how to do. He apologized. "I should not have permitted the circus. It was cruel, and we are not supposed to be children. I cannot fix what I did with words, but I can say the words and own them." Mara breathed out. "Thank you," she said. "I have nothing clever to offer." "Perhaps," he said, and the corner of his mouth almost made a word for smile, "you have everything that matters." He stared past her at the nets, which were gone, but in his mind they hung, patient, impossible, born from a wound and turned into a shield. "You fired once," he murmured. "That is all. You prepared for years to do it, and you did it right." The bright spiral will argue about what you did until it is old. If we are lucky, she said, they will argue quietly. He nodded, some wish in his eyes she could not decode. Go with the patience you own, he said then, and the channel closed. When the echoes died and only the breathing of the Hestia remained, Mara leaned at the glass and forced herself to feel the weight of the thing they had done. Not guilt. Responsibility's older, less theatrical cousin. She listened to the ship the way you listen to an instrument after a song. The chords were true. The frame settled, revealed a new balance. The world had not broken. Hestia whispered, "Shall I record this as the day the galaxy learned?" Mara smiled into the glass. "No," she said, "record it as the day we learned we could teach without killing." Hestia's lights dimmed in pleased modesty. Recorded. The galaxy did learn, but not all at once and not in the same language. The car had left the petrol system in knots that undid themselves without further violence. The observers filed stories, some silly and many sincere. The philanthropic watchers funded 2 human hospitals and an art program on a station where no children had laughed for a long time. The salvagers did not get their gentle remains. They took instead a new habit, to watch from farther away and to put their hooks back in their pockets when the slow ships passed. Hestia returned to her long path. She slept by degrees, waking only to trim trajectory, to align her mind with maps stretched across years. She dreamed in numbers the way whales dream in long cords beneath the ice. And within her, her small human crew returned to quiet jobs, the kinds that keep people alive more than they keep them proud. Hacken wrote a poem in Greece on the maintenance hatch because he had no other paper, and the words came whether he wanted them to or not. Alia sewed a small net out of twine and hung it from the ceiling over her bunk, so that she could wake in the night and lay a palm against the memory and be calmed. Matsu began growing a pale moss whose spores had been collected from somewhere near Saturn, when Saturn still had cloud parties with scientists. He used the morale allotment to request miniature bells. He hung them along the moss frame, and when the ship hummed, the bells answered. Mara walked the corridors and let herself be a person occasionally, until the next thing that needed a captain arrived. It was slow ship life, long hours of care, interrupted by moments where destiny asked for a raised hand. In the months that followed, rumors ripened. Some said the human payload was a pocket black hole that had been bribed with calculus. Others said it was prayer condensed into a bead. A Kharid scholar published a treatise comparing it to knitting. The Ascendancy's fleet manuals added an appendix on non-local large-mass anomalies, with language so stern it bordered on self-flagellation. A slice of the galaxy decided to leave humanity alone for a while. That was enough. When they reached the garden, it was not a garden. It was a world with too much wind and not enough ocean. A world whose rocks were the wrong shape if you liked comfort and the right shape if you liked endurance. They named it Thresh because it sounded like the first part of a harvest you do not know yet if you will finish. Hestia unfurled landers like leaves. She sang to the thin air and waited for it to thicken. She laid the bones of a city into the ground, pipes and hope, and the geometry of daydreams with measurements on it. People walked out onto the surface and cried because they had found dirt with rocks in it exactly the same as all the other dirt with rocks in it, and it was somehow still miraculous. The news of Thresh's first air garden drifted out across the networks to people who needed good news like bread. A Kharid child wrote a letter to Hestia and asked if the people there could see any animals yet. Mara wrote back that they saw each other, and that was enough to count. The child was satisfied and began to dream of a pet she would one day not keep because life changes you. The edict visited exactly once. No cameras, no press, no philanthropic watchers. Just the bruised flagship easing into a high orbit and sending down a quiet ping. Mara went out to the observation keel with a cup of tea that tasted like tin in summer. "Open," she told Hestia. A young voice answered, one that had not spoken before. Captain Ilyin. This is Initiate Cell, it said. I bring regards from Commander Hark. He died last month. He asked me to deliver the words he did not have time to say. Mara felt a small pain move through her like a fish through a reed bed. Speak, she said, and listened. He said, the young voice read carefully, each word placed with the precision of a ritual, that he was wrong to laugh. He said the galaxy is old enough for more than one way to be brave. He said, tell the human captain I learned to count time in different numbers. Tell her I remembered rain. Tell her I kept the promise and will teach others to do the same. Mara closed her eyes. Tell him thank you, she said finally. Tell him I kept the nets. I will, the Initiate said, and if there were tears in that voice, they sounded like a star's static. The edict circled 3 times. Stars are stories, 3 turns is one of their alphabets. Then it left. Thresh rotated toward a different set of suns, and Hestia slept again. Years passed the way years do when you build things. Quickly, for the days were full. Slowly, for the nights were longer. A city made of patience took root. It grew 1,000 hands and 1,000 stubborn spines. There were births and there were endings, and both were respectful and neither argued with the universe. Children on Thresh learned to play a game called Net, where they stood in a circle and passed a rope. The rope sang crowd songs when they did it right and bit their fingers when they pulled against each other. The universe did not forget them. It never forgets anyone for long. There came a season of fire, as there always does. It did not come from the Kharid. They had learned and were busy elsewhere with better uses for their pride. It came from a consortium of pale ships from the inner curve who believed that anything not using the fold must be hoarding something. They came thin and quick, meaning to strike, meaning to teach slowship humility. Mara woke to Hestia's voice for the 1,000th time, and none of the familiarity dulled the edge. Incoming, Hestia said. 9 vehicles, they claim authority from the seamless trade. On the plain outside the city were wind towers shaped like question marks. Between them, cables hummed like oversized bees. Work paused. Parents gathered their children with the same calm they used to gather herbs. No one screamed. There had been drills. Even the bells on the moss frame remembered what to do. Mara did not reach for the old weapon. The payload was one. The galaxy had seen it. One demonstration had been enough. The Hestia had not guarded nothing in the years since. She had found 1,000 little ways to make a place hard to hurt. She had made friends the way ships make wake. The 9 ships dropped into low orbits and aligned their mouths. They did not announce. They had the arrogance of velocity. There was no time for diplomacy dressed in good suits. Shade. Alia asked, quietly gray-haired now, hands still soft. Shade, Mara said. The new nets were not born exotic. They were cables and sails and plans. They were solar kites that had been told bedtime stories about justice. They slid from the wind towers and unfolded like a city learning a secret. They webbed the sky with long lines. The incoming ships found the sky heavier than their greed had estimated. They found their mouths dry. They found a planet telling them no. Hestia had partners now too. The edict came on first ping like a friend at a back door already wearing boots. A dozen Kharid anchors answered, more graceful than before because humility does that to muscles. A wet colony from the other side of the spiral sent a storm machine to raise auroras so gorgeous the incoming pilots could not decide whether to fight or to cry. Pilots who cry cannot shoot straight. The battle that followed was messy because real battles are. It had none of the pure geometry of Hestia's one perfect shot. It had improvisation and courage and mistakes patched immediately. It had a Kharid frigate putting itself between a trade lance and a human greenhouse, and that image would appear on the side of a schoolhouse 10 years later. It had a farmer called Jin who discovered that the net anchors would hum like lutes if you tuned the wind correctly, and that this hum interfered just enough with the incoming ship's rhythm to throw their timing. She invented a new instrument in 50 seconds and did not notice because she was busy surviving. Mara stood on the keel and watched and refused to pretend her heart was anything but a small animal praying. The first attacking ship hit the net and did not fall, because the nets had not been designed for falling. It slid, unpleasantly, into the waiting orbit of a Kharid tug, which locked onto it with stubborn love. Two more scissored along light and found themselves in a glare so bright their aim turned to confession. The galaxy began to learn in a second language what it had learned in a first. Endurance is clever. Endurance is a weapon. Endurance makes friends that do not leave. When the attacking ships realized the cost of insisting, they insisted less. They slunk away with mouths closed, all velocity and no arguments. They would write about economic pressures later and explain their mistakes through economics, because it is kinder to civilization than to confess you were cruel. But the story that spread was softer and stronger. It speaks still of a slow world defended by a slow ship and a fleet that had come once to mock. After the battle, there were broken solar kites and a greenhouse with a hole that looked like a mouth trying not to scream. There were dead. There are always dead. The bells on Matsu's moss frame sang by themselves in a draft, the pitch just off enough to feel like a question. The children walked the nets like tightropes because they wanted to feel the sky. The philanthropic watchers finally did something worth the name and built a small park where grass would grow over hidden rebar that held statues up. The statues were not of heroes. The statues were of hands tied in a net, the rope moving out of them like light. Mara stood with her crew and with the Edict's initiate, who had grown taller and who now wore the gold ridge of a commander. He did not mention his predecessor. He did not need to. He carried the memory like a ring you turn and turn on your finger because it fits with comforting pressure. "You fired once," he said to her, as if a thing said often enough gains new meaning. That was enough. "We fired once," she corrected, and her hand took in the galaxy without arrogance. The rest was everyone remembering how to be useful. Hestia recorded this too and buried it deep, not because she wanted to hide it, but because she loved the depths where long things sink. The years rolled. Thresh grew 2 cities, then 4, then a scattering of farm spires that knitted the wind to the earth and made humility smell like bread. The Kharid came and went without drama. The philanthropic watchers learned that it is harder to give well than to give loudly. A new slowship left another sun with another mission, and another beat of patience swaddled in fields. Humans in the bright spiral found their posture again. It did not point up. It held steady. Mara aged into slimness. Her hair went blacker before it went white, because of a mutation somewhere that no one bothered to fix. She learned to make a certain tea exactly and only shared it by accident. She walked until the day Hestia woke her and said, very quietly, the way you wake a person who told you please to wake me for this. There is a child outside asking to see the captain. The child was Kharid, with the color-shifting cheek ridges that meant he would be beautiful when it mattered to him. He held a toy net in both hands like a relic. He looked up at her and said very solemnly, "Is it true you made the sky heavy?" She crouched. Knees popped. "No," she said. "The sky is always heavy. I just know where to put the knots." He stared down at his toy, then up at the real one, then at her with an understanding that would grow or not, depending on what life allowed it. "Can I learn?" "Yes," she said, "and it will take a long time." He nodded as if he had expected that and was proud to be right. Down the slope, a wind tower bow-curved and light slid along its edge like blessings. Someone began to sing in a language she did not know. It melted into the sound of the moss-frame bells in the open door behind her. There were still hurts. There were still people who would come with mouths hungry for your wheat and your blood instead of for your songs. But there were also nets and friends and patience turned into torque. That night alone, Mara returned to the observation keel and pressed both hands to the glass. The stars were tired. A slow ship captain knows this. She knows every star is a worker who has earned a chair. She breathed the ship in the way you breathe a lover you are proud to have found. "Good night," she whispered. Good night, Hestia whispered back, and it sounded like rain on an old street, a photograph turning itself blank, a boy singing to beans. They drifted forward, ship and world and people, into cycles that did not care about applause. The bright spiral argued less loudly because arguing loudly wastes something you cannot replace. Sometimes, when someone at a party said, "Remember the human slowship," another someone smiled and answered, "The one that fired once." Because in the end it had not been about force. It had been about a long choice to move within the conjunction of mercy and preparation. It had been about a captain who did not want to be a hero and became half of one anyway. It had been about a galaxy that had forgotten there were other clocks besides the ones that run on pride, and learning the other clocks can be heard if you stop to listen. The petrol system became a pilgrimage site for people who loved good stories and quiet roads. The observation boys that had once watched a spectacle now watched nothing at all, because nothing had become the point. The luminous edict's descendants held adrift right there once a year. They did not call it apology. They called it the Day of Knots, and that name may outlast anything else about them. And somewhere far from Thresh and Hestia, and the Carid and the philanthropic watchers, a child born in a dome made of sandstone stretched his small hand out to catch dust motes. His mother told him a story while she wove. A ship that moved slowly through a laughing galaxy. A ship that fired once. A ship that made the sky heavy so that bad people slipped and good people could stand. The child laughed at the right places and then at the wrong ones, because laughter is a light that spills, and you cannot control where it lands. He looked at the weave and understood too much and exactly enough. He went to sleep before the ending, a privilege given only to the very young and the very old. Mara stood once more on the keel when the next slow ship saluted. Its captain was a woman with too many tattoos and a hopeless grin. Gardeners don't know they're brave, it's what lets them plant. They greeted each other with a look that contained maps. Hestia throbbed softly, a benediction from one old thing to another. They traded a box of seeds that had tasted 3 different suns. No letters of marque, no speeches, just hands. When the incoming captain drifted away, Hestia said, "You are crying." "I am not," Mara said gently. "I am leaking meaning." "Shall I collect it?" "No," she said. "Let it evaporate, let it become something else." The ship obeyed as ships do when they love you. Time did the slow trick it loves. A day came when Mara could no longer climb the ladder down to the keel without help. She scaled it anyway. She held to the rail and let the rail hold her. The stars looked close and kind in a way they had not before. A person can live a whole life among machines and still be surprised by kindness. The surprise is the trick. Her crew gathered and did not do the scripting because sometimes you do not demand a script carry more than it can bear. "Captain," Alia said, old and soft and every part of her full of thread. "Say it one more time for us." Mara knew what they wanted. She had used the phrase so rarely that when she did, it always dropped into the room with a satisfying weight. She said it now, last time and forever. "Forward," she murmured, and the word meant, "I trust you." The word meant, "I know you will make the knots without me." She did not stay to hear the reply. It came anyway, in this life and the next. Forward. In a galaxy that had once laughed at a slow ship, people began to count time in a new way. It was not better, not worse. It was honest. When conquering failed, they remembered enduring. When power tempted, they thought of the edict bruised and dignified. When winter came, they loved the long harvest. When enemies arrived, they placed their patience between themselves and harm like a hand. In the halls of the Carid academies, a student who needed a thesis wrote about the ethics of shade. In the domes of Thresh, children learned nets and knots before numbers and then numbers, because numbers free nets from mere rope. In the quiet places where people older than law weave the world together, a whisper grew that might, in another 1,000 years, be called faith. That you can choose the speed at which your courage manifests, and that speed need not be the one the loud insist upon. And in Hestia's record, in the archive that smelled like paper though it had never known a tree, there was a file with a small image of a star line and a curve of dark the shape of a lesson. Beside it, a caption Hestia wrote alone because ships are allowed to write truth when their captains won't. It read, "We fired once. We gathered every other time. The final telling of the tale will always be simple. It will fit into a palm or a net or a bead that reminds the universe of a promise. You will know it when you hear it, not because of any rhetoric, but because of how heavy it feels without hurting. You will know it because it moves to the next person, the next ship, the next world, and leaves in its wake a trace that hums when the wind is right. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures." Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.